My name is Joe Klopchik. I'm a level 2. I live here in Seattle. It was like a 20-minute drive this morning. It was awesome. I'm glad to see you all here today. My presentation today is going to be about beginning Pokemon Go play. I'm going to talk to all of you about what you should do as new trainers and how you can get jump started into playing Pokemon Go. So a quick, if my mouse wants to work, a quick summary of what we're going to be talking about. All of these things over here, and then we'll talk about teams, and then a quick thing about discovering Pokemon.
So you're getting a low accuracy mark, man.
So before we get started, there's a couple formalities. First, I need everybody to sign in on this sign-in sheet. I'm going to start it over here. Just send it back and then back this way. Make sure you sign in on the sign-in sheet. There's going to be one at every single presentation. And if you're absent for like half of them, they might not give you foil, so I wouldn't advise that one. The second thing is we have these sheets to rate your presentations. I'm going to start them over here. If people need one, grab one. You will have the same sheet for all of your presentations. Just make sure you have one. And our third technicality is, unfortunately, I can't present this today. I have to talk about this. Oh, my mouse really doesn't like moving today. We have to talk about the history of this trigger. But based on the fact that all of you are here, I'm sure you are all excited about this triggers. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about how this trigger works, and we're going to mainly talk about the way we write policy. So if we move on by one slide, what we're going to learn today is what a mistrigger is. I would hope that most of you have a decent understanding about how we deal with mistrigger at competitive rules enforcement level. We'll do a quick overview, but we want to have that solid understanding. And then we want to ask the question, why? Why did we change policy to be the way it is now? We're going to start 15 years ago, back in 2001, and look at all of the changes we made to mistrigger policy and see why we made those changes. So there's three things that we care about. The first one is that policy is consistent. It's easy to write policy that allows for broad interpretations, and that means that not every tournament will be run the same way. We don't want that. We want judges to be able to look at policy and go, yes, I know what the answer should be. The second thing is that it should be intuitive. We want judges to be able to learn policy quickly. We could write policy that is extremely complicated and tells you exactly what to do if anyone ever does anything, and then no one would ever want to learn it. And it would be awful. We'll get to a little bit of that later on today. If you've been judging for more than a few years, you may know what I'm talking about. And finally is wiggle room. As much as we want everything to be consistent, the game changes. We want people to know what to do when they come up with a scenario that doesn't fit with policy. And then, yeah.
Switch the light so that the one up there is dimmer because it's hard to see that. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, because I'll let you all like that. Hooray. And then the last thing that matters a little bit less to us, but we still do care because customer service is important for judging, is that the players have a good experience. So we don't want policy that is unintuitive to players or makes them do things that they don't want to do or encourages them to cheat. So we'll see a couple of those situations a little bit later. So let's start with, this mouse really doesn't like me. Okay, current mistriggers. So, who wants to describe how current mistrigger works? Anyone? Any volunteers? No? No? Okay, so forgetting matters. So what happens, how do we get a mistrigger? When something triggers in the game and they forget to announce that it's supposed to happen. So the first two things here is that they actually need to forget. If they do the thing and they don't say anything out loud, that's usually okay. And there is an amount of time they have to point it out. So there are four things in the current mistrigger policy, 4 different types of triggers that have different times that people have to remember the trigger for. Does anyone know what any of those are? Any volunteers? No? I know some of you do. Don't look at me funny. Okay, I'll start with the first one. Go ahead.
I'll give you one of them.
Go ahead.
Power and toughness changing.
Okay, so power and toughness change is an example of a mistrigger that doesn't, or a trigger that doesn't change the visual game scenario. It doesn't change what the game looks like at all. And the answer there is they don't have to point it out until it matters. In fact, the answer for all 4 categories is really they don't have to point it out until it matters. Our other 3 categories are if a trigger has a target, then they need to point it out when they put it on the stack. We need to have a target for an ability. We can't pretend like it was put on the stack if it didn't have a target. So they need to point it out right away. The other ones are if a trigger requires a choice on resolution, or it does something that does affect the game state on resolution, like putting a counter on something, then we have to point it out. Before we did something, that would indicate we're past the point where it resolved. So if I have a trigger that says put +1/+1 counter on this in my upkeep, and I draw a card, we've gone too far. You've indicated that we can't be in your upkeep anymore. And then finally, we have the kind of narrow range triggers that change the rules of the game, and those kind of act like the same as visual representation triggers, or non-visual representation. You just can't let your opponent take an action that breaks the new rule. So if you change the rules and say creatures have to be blocked by every creature, then you can't let them block with only one creature if they have a bunch of other ones. But if you do, then you miss the turn. And then finally, warning. So competitive rules enforcement level, we give out warnings for triggers. We give out warnings for half of, well, one category of triggers, and those are triggers that we consider to be generally detrimental. They are bad. They are triggers that people don't want to happen, and if you miss it, then that's a good thing for you, so we're going to give you a warning and keep track of them. Triggers like gaining life or doing something good for you, we don't consider them generally detrimental, and we won't give out a warning. The other thing worth noting here is that we don't step into the game and stop players if they miss a trigger that we don't think is detrimental. If we're not going to give them a warning, we're not going to step in. So with all those things in mind, I know that's a lot of stuff, but I hope most of you know it already, we're going to step back in time and talk about this trigger history. So this whole process, I'm going to start back in 2001 with an old document called the DCI Penalty Guide in 2001. And we're going to talk about what we did back in 2001 for missed triggers. And then we're going to talk about why we did that, and then we're going to look at how it changed and why we made all those changes. So first we have DCI Penalty Guide for 2001. So does anyone care to guess what the penalty for missing a trigger was in 2001? Go for it, Doug.
Game loss.
Okay, so the penalty could have been game loss. The name of the infraction was card misrepresentation. Yes, it's brilliant. You misrepresented a card. In fact, we didn't have a mistrigger penalty. We just had this general, you did something wrong in the game, you misrepresented the game, that's bad. And how we dealt with card misrepresentation was the judge decided how they wanted to fix it, and then they fixed it. In general, it acted kind of like the way we deal with game rules violations right now, in that if you wanted to rewind back to where the error was, you could, and then you could make the trigger resolve, but if you didn't, then you just didn't do anything. But the main problem here is that because we didn't treat them like triggers as a separate thing, both players needed to keep track of triggers, and if your opponent missed a trigger, then you were technically required to tell someone, and you were guilty of misrepresenting the game because you missed the trigger too, which we'll talk a little bit more about why that's a problem later on. But the gist of it is when you have to point out your opponent's triggers, it feels like you have to play the game for them, which is bad. So we can talk about the three things we mentioned earlier. The first one is consistency. This policy is obviously inconsistent. When you give judges the flat-out ability to do whatever they want, you misrepresent, do whatever you want, then they can do whatever they want. We could rule something here and rule something different in Texas, and who knows what's going to happen when we miss our in terms of being intuitive, it's actually fairly intuitive when most of the rules just say, do what you think is okay. That would be great. Unfortunately, it's extremely inconsistent, so we don't want to stick with that. So a couple other things about the penalty guide. We're going to talk a little bit about how the penalty guide kind of moved forward over the years. So rules enforcement level in 2001, there were 5 rules enforcement levels. They were rules enforcement level 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. 1 and 2 were kind of like regular. You could describe them as 1 being like a pre-release and 2 being like an F&M, but we treated pretty much everything at those like regular, and the penalty was a caution for missing a trigger. At 3, it was basically like competitive rules enforcement level, and the penalty was a warning. And at 4 and 5, it was like professional rules enforcement level. The penalty was also a warning, but it was quicker to upgrade to a game loss. So you got an extra warning in between to upgrade to a game loss. All right, so let's move on. Next up, this mess keeps going to sleep. So in September of 2001, we changed the DCI penalty guide, and we created a new penalty called procedural error, which, as ambiguous as it claims to be, like card misrepresentation, did kind of make it more descriptive about what a mistrigger is. But basically it was the same penalty, and we ended up with 3 different categories. Those being minor, major, and severe. So minor The idea was, you made a small mistake, we don't care, here's a caution. We're just going to let the game continue, or put the trigger on the stack, or do whatever we need to do to fix it, and we don't care very much. Major, we gave a warning, and severe, we gave a game loss. So when we talk about consistency, this actually made the policy a little bit less consistent, since you gave judges the opportunity to just pick severe if they wanted to, if they thought something was bad enough. And they could pick major if they thought it just deserved a warning. And I'm sure, as you guys have all learned, or at least talked about, reverse engineering penalties isn't the greatest thing in the world, and this basically encouraged that. In 2001, they did establish the upgrade path that we have. We don't really look at it anymore, but that two cautions would upgrade to a warning, 2 warnings would upgrade to a game loss, 2 game losses would upgrade to a match loss, and if you managed another penalty, they would just disqualify you. So it used to be possible to get upgraded warnings to make it all the way to a DQ. We don't do that anymore. That is very unfortunate. So yeah, that's 2001. It is fairly inconsistent, but still relatively intuitive, easy to learn, because you just do whatever you want. Okay, so we now move on to January 2007. Between 2001 and 2007, there were a few different changes, but mostly they were just wording stuff, and they really didn't talk much about missed triggers, so we're going to skip them. In 2007, there was a large update to the way we deal with penalties called the Infraction Procedure Guide. And the main thing that the Infraction Procedure Guide did, at least that we care about, is that it classified gameplay errors. Gameplay errors became game rule violations, or missed triggers, or looking at your cards, or drawing at your cards, all these penalties that we care about. And the thing we care about here is that we created the missed trigger. The penalty that specifically cares about missed triggers, and specifically cares about when we miss them in the game, and tells us how to deal with them. The thing that the IPG decided to include was the classic flowchart. Now, I'm not going to show you the whole flowchart because I don't expect you to remember it, but basically it asked a few questions. It said, was the ability a May ability? If it was, then we consider them to have missed it, we don't care. Then we want to know if it's been more than a turn, then we don't care. And then we, I'm forgetting one. Right, there were a couple other things. Anyways, flowchart. Flowchart was difficult to learn. In terms of consistency, it was a piece of policy that you could look at the flowchart and tell exactly what to do. And at the end of the flowchart, it would tell you to put the trigger on the stack if it had been within a turn. So generally, if we're within a turn, we're going to end up with a trigger on the stack, and all our triggers are going to happen. Notably, this means we're not rewinding. We are no longer in game rule violation territory. We are now putting the trigger on the stack, which, if you're familiar with how competitive play works now, is actually a pretty good solution. Triggers just resolving now that should have resolved earlier. There's generally not very many problems that cause the game to progress forward. The other thing that the IPG included here was the clause for default actions, that if a player has a trigger, that if they choose not to do something, then something else happens, like a slaughter pact or any of the pacts that say in your upkeep, pay this mana if you don't lose the game. It's a default action. It said if they don't do the thing, then we just apply the default action now, which is good because if we consider slaughter pact in 2001, which didn't exist, but bear with me. If you miss your slaughter pact to lose the game trigger in 2001, we have a couple options. We can rewind and put it on the stack, or we can give you a severe procedural error and make you lose the game. Which kind of fixes it, but it's kind of annoying. Now we end up with default actions, we just apply them now. And then the last thing on the slide is failure to maintain game state, because there once was a day where mistrigger included failure to maintain game state. The other player still had to point out that you missed your trigger. We were still requiring players to police their opponents, or to play the game for their opponents, and to tell them when they missed their triggers, which, as I mentioned before, is really painful. When if your opponent plays a siege gang commander and they don't get their tokens, you don't want them to have your tokens, and it sucks that the game says it's cheating if you don't tell them to have their tokens. I had that specific ruling, the siege gang commander was in standard way back when, and people really didn't like it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to a bunch of fixes that changed little nitpicky things in the IPG, and we're going to talk about how each one changes why it's either more consistent or more easy to learn before we get to 2012. Because 2012 is really interesting. So So first, in June 2007, we have these two things happening. Clarification that the controller of the trigger is the one getting the penalty. That sounds a bit weird, but if you read the actual policy, it seems to indicate that if I had a trigger that made you take an action, if you didn't do it, then you get the penalty. Which is kind of strange. If I have a Howling Mine, I shouldn't be allowed to just be like, go, hope you don't draw, and even if you don't draw, you get a warning. That's bad. We don't like that. I don't think anyone ever actually gave a warning for that, but they fixed the policy. In terms of consistency, it's obviously better that we clarify who gets it, although it does add one extra piece of information to the rules. It is fairly intuitive though, so it's not so bad. And then clarification how skipped phases interact with the turn cycle. So the IPG included a piece of wording that said if the trigger was in the last turn cycle, then we're going to put it on the stack. The idea of turn cycle is now gone from the IPG as of about a year ago, but it's basically if we're in my first main phase, I have until my next first main phase to point out the trigger, and then I'll get a warning and the trigger will go on the stack. Obviously, if I skip my next first main phase, this will break. The idea of the turn cycle breaks, so they included a clarification on how to deal with that, and you would just go to the next phase. Okay, next up, December 2007. So this first one is really interesting. There was like a 5-year period where, for the purposes of mistrigger, the card drawn during the draw step in a game of Magic is considered to be a trigger. So yes, this doesn't apply anymore. Please never give out a mistrigger for this. Does anyone have any thought as to why this would be good?
Or from a game perspective, or from the rules?
Just like in applying this policy, why does this work out for the players? Because it was a for the players and make this easier thing. Yeah.
It feels better for the player when you're able to just put the draw on the stack, so they end up not missing it.
Exactly. So if I forget to draw and I play a land and I attack, and then we call a judge and say I forget to draw, if we treat it like a game rule violation, we have this either rewind or do nothing. And back in 2007, there wasn't a let a player draw a card partial fix for game rule violations, so if you chose not to rewind, they just didn't get their card. Sorry, you don't get your card. So this gives us the option to just put the draw trigger on the stack and then let them draw. So fix that problem. In terms of consistency, I think the rewind versus not rewind GRV thing is a little bit inconsistent. This makes it a little bit easier. Obviously, this is a very specific piece of policy that people have to learn, so not the easiest thing in the world to learn. So we talked about that, and then we had a slight change that said within a reasonable time is the amount of time. So we're talking about giving failure to maintain game state from his triggers. If you didn't point it out, like, I guess this kind of breaches into there are four amount of times that you have to point out your trigger, that the opponent can't really know when you've missed it. So if you say they missed it because they didn't say it was on the stack, we're still going to give you failure to maintain game state. That's kind of So we gave them a little bit more time. Say one or two actions happened and they realized that we wouldn't be giving it failure to maintain game state, which makes it a little bit more easy to apply policy, and it's kind of more in line with what we do anyways. March 2008. So at regular rules enforcement level, we no longer give out warnings. This is pretty good. I'm sure a lot of you have judged many FNMs. We don't like giving out warnings at FNMs. Back in 2008, there was no judging at regular rules enforcement level. So that means the IPG applied at FNM, and you could give out warnings and game losses at FNM if you wanted to. This fixed the problem. Obviously, people at FNM miss a lot of triggers. We don't want them accumulating a whole bunch of warnings and getting disqualified for FNM because they don't know how to play their triggers. The inconsistent part about this is we now had a penalty that had two different penalties for the same infraction at different rules enforcement levels, which made studying for L1 difficult. Back in 2008, you had to take a judge test that included the IPG to become an L1, and you had to know the difference between regular and competitive for all of these infractions. And this was just another one that had caution instead of warning and regular. Okay, let's move on. June 2009. Clarify that if an opponent is supposed to make a choice and there is a default action, don't resolve that immediately. So this is the case where suppose I had a weird card, I can't think of a specific example, where I cast a Slaughter Pact, but then in your upkeep you have to pay mana, and if you don't, you lose the game. Strong interpretations of policy would indicate that if I miss that trigger, and we find this out later, you lose the game. We apply the default action immediately. That is obviously not what we should feel like happens. The players didn't like it for whatever trigger this dealt with, so we changed the rules. Yeah.
Would that be like a tabernacle thing?
Yeah, Tabernacle is a good example. Well, no, Tabernacle is not a good example because Tabernacle gives your creatures that ability.
Rhystic Study would be a good one.
Yeah, here you go, Rhystic Study. Yeah. So we put the trigger on the stack and we deal with it now. Rhystic Study, they pay 1 and you draw a card. So obviously they get the chance to pay 1 when you point out the trigger. You don't just get to draw cards because of the trigger. So in terms of players, it's better. Judges, it's more intuitive. Obviously, adding another line of rules makes things a little bit less consistent, or makes things more consistent but less intuitive. But this one's pretty easy because obviously you're not going to just let them draw the card for Rhystic Study because you forgot the trigger. Okay, September 2009. This is the first time this piece of rules showed up. This is pretty obvious. It falls into the same category as May abilities. If a player is required to choose up to X of something, they choose 0 and the ability resolved. So if you don't choose to target any things, then it just happens. Same kind of thing, we're adding more to the rules. Kind of have to remember this, but it kind of falls into the same bucket of May abilities, so not that difficult to learn. Feels better for players, etc. Okay, so in January 2010, we get to get rid of failure to maintain game state. Hooray! Except it really didn't get rid of failure to maintain game state. The opponent was still required, and they just moved it all into failure to maintain game state. So this didn't actually do anything. But it did happen in January 2010. In March of 2010, so many of you might remember that in the summer of 2009, a Magic set called Magic 2010, or Magic 2010, something like that, M10, came out, and they changed some of the words in the game. And we changed them 9 months later to match in the IPG. The IPG had the words in play and removed from the game for a long time, and the game did not, which is kind of the game. So yeah, 2010, we made things, let's just say easier to learn, because this is a bit confusing when they say the wrong things. Okay, July 2010. The judging at regular rules enforcement level was introduced. This is great. This is kind of when L1 was redefined, so that L1s don't need to study the IPG anymore. They get to study the jar, and they don't need to care about IPG, which obviously made it a little bit easier for them to learn. It made judging at regular less consistent, but that's fine, because we just want to find a fix that makes players happy. Obviously, regular, we care about education, we care about people having fun. If we miss things a little bit, as long as the players are happy, we're cool. The jar fix for mistrigger then is the same as it is now, which is... Yeah, put it on the stack. Hooray! We did it. Everybody gets all the triggers. It would be nice if everybody pointed out their opponent's triggers, but we don't really care. You can be a scumbag and not point out your opponent's triggers. I'm a scumbag sometimes. People miss lots of ingest triggers. For the rest of this presentation, we're not going to talk about regular. We're going to be talking about just competitive. But the jar kind of became its own thing, and it's its own entity in terms of learning rules. This definitely made the IPG more consistent, because at this point, competitive and professional existed, and now they were all the same, and we treated them the same. We didn't have to learn about a whole bunch of complicated things. Okay, next up is August of 2012. This is the fun one. In August of 2012, we had a giant blog post by Toby Elliott that talked about a lot of changes to mistriggers. In fact, everything was exactly the same, except for this piece of words. So, judges should not intervene when they witness a trigger that is a lapsing ability as defined below. So, a lapsing ability is probably a term that you don't know, but this does introduce the ability. So, before 2012, if you saw someone miss a trigger, you stepped in and told them and you gave them a warning. Now, we don't do that. If it's a beneficial trigger, which is a lot of triggers, we don't do that. So, what's a lapsing ability? Well, lapsing ability is kind of the predecessor to our non-detrimental triggers. And I'm going to show you a big block of text. Don't read this. This is the giant block of text that talked about what to do for lapsing abilities. You had to learn all of this. So we're going to take that off the screen so you don't have to read it and replace it with another giant block of text. This is a list of all of the things that are lapsing abilities. I'm not going to leave them on the screen very long either, but if you look at them, you can see they're generally not detrimental things. And we'll move on to this slide where we talk about handling lapsing, and then I'll tell you what was on the last two slides. So basically, lapsing things are things that are not detrimental, except they were highly codified. That list that you saw on the last slide was exactly what was a lapsing trigger. Nothing else. Even if you could think it would be, if it's not on the list, you don't get it. And then the other stipulation was that if something could be a lapsing trigger, then it was. So a trigger that said, when it resolves, at the beginning of your upkeep, choose one. You gain 2 life, your opponent loses 2 life. I guess you gain 2 life or you lose 2 life. That's a lapsing ability because it could be a lapsing ability. The way we dealt with lapsing abilities was we split the turn into 2 individual invisible parts: pre-combat, combat, and post-combat. If you remembered the trigger during the part of the turn that you missed it, then your opponent got to put it on the stack. Just kind of like what we do now, but we give them a little bit more time. But they want it to be cautious and not give a lot of time for that. And then otherwise, we don't do anything. We don't give a penalty. So this looks kind of a lot like what we do now. The problem is, I can't remember what's on the next slide. Yeah, well, so why do we make this? Why do we make this change? And was it a good idea or a bad idea? So this change was made because it feels really bad to have to tell your opponent to put their triggers on the stack. So we wanted to give a list of types of triggers that players could just let their opponent miss, and that everybody would be more happy. That was a decision to make players more happy, but obviously it was really tough to learn. It was a really consistent piece of policy. If you learned exactly what a lapsing trigger was and exactly how the whole thing worked, and spent 10 hours studying it, you could apply the policy exactly correctly and everyone would be happy. But not everybody could do that. It was obviously complicated. I didn't want to show you those slides because you'd read them and you'd get confused, and we don't want to talk about that anymore. So it was generally a good idea because we ended up in a better place about this detrimental versus not detrimental. You have a question?
No, I was just gonna, after that, it sounds like the policy itself as written maybe was consistent, but the policy as enforced, if it's unlearnable, is not.
Exactly, that's the thing. Like, there's a lot of those, like in some of our downgrades and upgrades in policy right now, they allow for consistency, but if not everybody knows it, then it's difficult. So those are some of the, like, there's a reason why we're trying to move towards not giving game losses for anything. It'd be nice if we could never get a game loss again. That way we don't have to deal with these downgrade situations. But yeah, if you can't learn it, it's difficult. And the other thing worth noting here is that the card drop return was changed to a GRV. We got rid of that. So August 2012, or September 2007 to August 2012, drawing for your turn was a trigger, but not really. So next up, I'm going to show you the first 5 lines from Toby's blog post, I believe in September of 2012. And this is the reason why it changed away from lapsing triggers. Yeah, pretty much what I said. It was too hard to learn. I spent a lot of time memorizing what lapsing triggers were and talking to people about whether things were lapsing triggers or not. And in the end, it was hard to learn. And people didn't want to learn it, and even though you didn't need it for L1, L1s were trying to learn it to run their GPTs at competitive, and it was just a pain.
Can't confirm, was studying for L2 at the time.
So September 2012, we basically changed to what we have today. We changed lapsing to be generally, or the opposite of generally detrimental. So regular triggers were generally detrimental. We step in, we give the warning, and then the only thing that September 2012 missed was it didn't have that 4 times or 4 amounts of time that you had to remember your trigger. It was kind of just the vague, if we haven't passed the point in the game where the trigger should have resolved. Good question?
Is it still on your opponent to remember your triggers?
No.
Okay.
Right now, here, no. With September 2012, they said effectively everything is lapsing, and then we're going to give you triggers, or we're going to give you warnings for the bad ones, and we'll step in for the bad ones. Okay. But yeah, September 2012 is where we made the change that now, so I believe in the earlier one is actually where they made that change, that the opponent was no longer responsible for pointing out triggers at all, but generally if your opponent has a generally detrimental trigger or a non-lapsing trigger, you're going to want to point it out because they're the bad ones. Okay, so we have this vague, we're going to put it, or you have until we move past the point where it should have resolved, something like that, which was a little bit inconsistent. It meant that there were arguments about whether responding to triggers meant that you missed them or any of those things. So in February 2013, we learned when things are actually missed. We get our 4 rules about things being trigger, non-visual, changing the rules of the game, and making choices, normal triggers. And we get a small change to zone change triggers, which is, I'm not a fan of this change because it is one of those consistency things that are tough to learn. If I forget to return your thing with Oblivion Ring, you always get it back. That's how the rules work now. The rule specifically says if a trigger was missed that should return an object to a zone that it was taken from before or something like that, then we just put it back now, even if it was missed a long time ago. That means that you can never forget to return your obsidat. I don't think there's anything in standard right now that's a good example of this. January 2015. Demonstrating what action is to be taken is now enough. So there was a little bit of vagueness about whether you had to actually take the action and put a counter on something, or what saying the word trigger was good enough or not good enough. So actually saying, I'm going to put 3 counters on my guy, attack. You reach for counters, your opponent can't be like, Judge, he missed his trigger, he attacked. Saying, I'm going to put 3 counters on my guy is good enough. That's an intuitive thing. Obviously, if you say you're going to put 3 counters on your guy, it makes sense that you haven't missed your trigger. So we let that happen. And then, right now, so one of the more recent things with clarification about saying Geist trigger or saying attack for 6 when you attack with Geist of Take Draft, that's specifically being allowed. Or saying triggers specifically being allowed. It's kind of a wishy-washy part of policy still that's a little bit inconsistent, but that makes it a little bit easier to learn. And then part B was that I think this was just like a new card that we never had a trigger that made copies of spells. No, we did a lot.
Storm?
Storm, yeah, okay, so this was Storm. Is that a specific handling of Storm that you actually can't miss your Storm triggers unless you just intentionally miss them and forget to say, yes, all of my copies of Tendrils resolve and you die. Trust me, people tried to do that. It's like, oh, Tendrils, okay, it resolves. Then you go, okay, you die. And they're like, wait, you didn't say Storm. No. Okay. Okay, so problems in corner cases with current policy. If anyone else has any other ones, this is my favorite one. Yeah. So if I have an Eldrazi Mimic, which is a card that says, whenever a colorless creature enters the battlefield under my control, I can have its base power and toughness become that creature's power and toughness until end of turn. And Thought-Knot Seer, which is in standard still, Eldrazi Mimic's in standard. Anyways, Thought-Knot Seer says when this enters the battlefield, I get to Thoughtseize my pick. If I play Thought-Knot Seer with my Eldrazi Mimic, and I say triggers, and my opponent lays their hand out, like move something, whatever, and then I attack. And my opponent says, okay, I'll take 6, and I'm like, no, you take 8. My Thought-Knot Seer is big. It's not really clear whether we acknowledge the Eldrazi Mimic. In this case, it's non-visual, but then the problem becomes if the opponent dismembers our Thought-Knot Seer in response, we have a different answer. So if I say triggers and then ignore the fact that I don't want my Eldrazi Mimic to die, and then attack with it, and my opponent asks me how big it is, I can say 2-1, but I can also say it's dead. It's a really wishy-washy corner case scenario that doesn't work well with what we currently have. Well, yeah, that is the end of the mistrigger portion of my presentation. If people have questions about those triggers, I'll be happy to field them.
Specifically about the example you just
Yeah.
gave, Eldrazi Mimic, isn't that a May ability? Or
Yeah, see, that's the other problem. It is a May ability.
So basically, what he has to respond to it while it's on the stack, otherwise it becomes a 4/4.
Right.
So while it's on the stack, then once that resolves and kills the thing, he can just say, choose not to. So it would seem still fairly intuitive that it would be a 2/1 if it's still on the battlefield attacking.
But it's kind of the opposite of what we said if I said Thought-Knot Seer and we didn't do anything else. So we're using the same piece of policy and saying that it means 2 different things because we get the answer that we want, which is why it's inconsistent. Yeah, what's up, Megan?
Oh, kind of along those same
Sure.
lines. isn't it assumed to have happened unless specifically pointed out otherwise?
But it was May. So this is a May ability. So I say trigger my Thought Seer, look at you, but I also pointed out my Eldrazi Mimic, and then I attack, and we say it's a 4/4. That makes sense. I wanted to do all the things and made it a 4/4. That seems completely reasonable.
Right.
But then,
that's what I mean.
But the other way, when we say we dismember it, we suddenly get to make the decision that we didn't do it by taking the same action. So the player isn't saying whether they did it or not, and we're just assuming that they did the right thing. It's just unclear whether we should be looking at it either way, and whether one should be a game rule violation, and how we fix the game rule violation if we just make it 2-1. I guess I could have looked a little bit more into this, but we had a knowledgeable scenario that we wanted to do this, and we didn't run it because it was confusing and we didn't want to confuse a bunch of people on the internet. Yeah?
How would you grade our current mistrigger policy on consistency and intuitiveness?
Right now, I think it is actually quite good for all of them because I can explain how to deal with mistriggers generally in like 10 seconds. Like, is it bad? Give them a warning. Otherwise, do nothing, and then ask the opponent whether to put the trigger on the stack. That's mistriggers, right? Like, there's other little things, but you know
I think it's worth pointing out that the previous rules redefinition is what made everybody think that this is a lot harder to learn.
Yeah.
Because
So if
there
we
was
didn't
that
have
really
lapsing in
complicated
between
one.
and we made the jump to this, people wouldn't have thought this was that bad. The lapsing just made the whole thing complicated. Yeah.
Do you think that corner cases like this are the reason why some of the changes have been made to the mistrigger policy, such as like Dark Confidant triggers and things like that?
Yeah. So players, new cards coming into existence that push the edge of the rules are generally some of the reasons why we move things along. A lot of people complaining also. That's probably why we ended up with lapsing, is because enough people started complaining that they hated playing the game for their opponent. Like, I know people that specifically told me, obviously outside of events, yeah, if my opponent misses a trigger, I usually know, and I just don't tell them. And it's like, yes, so you just told me that you cheat all the time. And the problem is, like, it's unenforceable. If you say, oh, the guy's like, oh yeah, I should have gained 2 life in my upkeep, and you're like, oh yeah, I missed it too, right? Like, we're just going to accept that.
How do you feel about the mistriggers where like it affects a player's life total, but the person doesn't announce it and still makes a change, but the other player doesn't know about it? Because there was an instance several years back when this went with a stab wound.
Yeah, the Jackie Lee DQ thing. Yeah, that one's fun. Obviously, having to announce your life total is something that it's a part of the rules that is kind of necessary in order to make mistriggers work. Although the answer now, I believe, is if you don't announce it, you just didn't get it. Just writing your life total down isn't good enough. And I think it handles it relatively consistently. It's one of those situations that at a big competitive event, you're probably going to get an L3 involved, and we're probably going to investigate, especially when there's potential for people being confusing. The thing about the Jackie Lee thing was that like the change in life total could have decided the outcome of the game. So there's like this incentive to not say this thing because you don't want your opponent to know. And it's the best way to handle it as a player is to always be very clear with what triggers you're announcing. But unfortunately, players don't really understand that. Do we have any other questions? No? Okay, so I have one last slide. Or 2 last slides. What did we learn? We learned that Toby's really smart. He wrote most of this policy. He's thought through this whole thing. He really didn't want to give me the IPG that had lapsing abilities in it, so I could include in this presentation. But I think it has some value, and we learned why it was terrible and why we moved forward. And one thing to think about is our current changes in the last year to hidden card error kind of follow the same path as this, the same thought process. So if you're having trouble understanding those or trouble understanding future policy changes, think about why it was changed. Think about how this impacts players, why this policy becomes more consistent, and why it might be easier to learn. Obviously, it's difficult to learn when you're changing from one, like when we made the big change at the beginning of last year, beginning of this year, to make HCE exist and drawing extra cards to go away. That's a lot of changes. They're going to be difficult to understand because you understood the old part. But actually understanding hidden card error from the ground up, ignoring what drawing extra cards used to be, isn't as difficult. So it can be difficult to kind of forget old things, but I do think hidden card error is kind of what it used to be. And finally, I want to advance. If you want more information on Pokemon Go, Brian Spellman's Advanced Pokemon Go Seminar will be room 206, one over there. In the next session, we'll be talking about IVs and all other kinds of cool things with Pokemon Go. And so it is currently 12:40. We have 20 extra minutes. Do we have the attendance sheet? Did they get back here? Hooray! And everybody has a rating thing? Everybody got one? Okay, hooray, we're all done here. Please, thanks a lot.